It was a bright, early Saturday morning when I decided to finally dedicate some time to my small front yard garden, a modest but carefully tended space filled with a mix of flowers, herbs, and small shrubs that I had planted over the past few months with the hope of creating a little oasis of calm and greenery in the otherwise busy suburban street where I lived. And as I grabbed my watering can and turned on the hose, I felt the familiar sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing you are nurturing something with your own hands. While the morning sun began to cast a gentle warmth across the neighborhood, highlighting the neatly trimmed lawns and tidy driveways that lined either side of the street. As I moved methodically through the garden, gently pouring water at the base of each plant and making sure not to oversoak the soil. Around the delicate seedlings, I noticed the subtle sounds of the neighborhood coming alive, the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block, the occasional bark of a dog, and the rhythmic chirping of birds settling into the branches of nearby trees, all of which contributed to the quiet, peaceful atmosphere that had made me look forward to this small moment of care and relaxation in my otherwise hectic schedule. I was completely absorbed in the task, checking each plant for signs of wilting leaves or new growth, occasionally trimming a stray stem that had grown in an awkward direction, and marveling at the way the flowers seemed to respond almost immediately to the careful application of water. When I became aware of movement out of the corner of my eye and saw a woman across the street on her porch, her arms folded tightly and her posture rigid, staring directly at me with an expression that combined irritation, disbelief, and a kind of judgmental intensity that immediately set off an uncomfortable awareness that someone had decided to take offense at something I had not yet even realized could be offensive. At first, I assumed that she was merely curious or perhaps interested in the garden itself, and I continued watering the plants, giving a polite nod in her direction in case she expected some acknowledgement, only to find that her gaze remained fixed and unyielding, and within a few minutes she had walked down her walkway and onto the sidewalk at the edge of her property, taking deliberate steps toward the street as if preparing to confront me over some imagined wrongdoing rather than simply observing a neighbor tending to their yard. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet street and causing me to pause mid-pour, the hose in my hands resting gently against the soil, while I looked up to see her standing just a few feet from the curb, pointing toward my garden as if to frame her complaint. And though I hoped it might be something minor or friendly, the sharpness in her tone and the way she leaned slightly forward suggested that the interaction was going to be anything but pleasant. She continued toward me in a brisk, determined manner, her arms now crossed tightly and her facial expression tightening as she demanded, "Are you seriously watering your plants right now?" With a tone that implied that the question was rhetorical and that she had already decided my actions were wrong and somehow offensive, and for a moment I found myself at a loss for how to respond to the sudden intensity of this unsolicited confrontation over what I had always considered a normal, everyday task on my own property. I paused politely, setting the watering can down briefly on the edge of the flower bed so that I could speak without obstruction and explain calmly that yes, I was watering my garden because the sun was rising and the soil had become dry overnight, emphasizing that my plants needed attention just as any other living thing does, and that I had been careful to ensure that the water stayed within the boundaries of my own yard, fully expecting that such a reasonable explanation would be sufficient to end the interaction. Her frown deepened, and she shook her head in a gesture of absolute disapproval, stepping even closer to the sidewalk and gesturing toward my garden, as if the mere act of applying water to my own property constituted a disruption to public order, insisting that I needed to stop immediately because she personally found the activity offensive. And although I continued speaking in a calm, measured tone to clarify the legality and harmlessness of my actions, it became evident that she had no interest in hearing any explanation that did not conform to her own rigid expectations. Before I could finish my sentence, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and announced loudly that she was going to call the police because I was refusing to stop. What she had decided was inappropriate behavior, explaining that the situation was urgent and that it required immediate law enforcement intervention despite the fact that no actual disturbance, property damage, or illegal activity was occurring and that the water had remained confined to my flower beds without spilling onto the sidewalk or the street. I continued to water my plants in a slow, deliberate manner, making sure each root and seedling received sufficient hydration, fully aware that her phone call was underway and that the sound of running water might be carried over the line to the dispatcher. and I noted with a mixture of disbelief and quiet frustration how quickly something as ordinary as caring for my garden had escalated into a scenario requiring official intervention in her mind, while other neighbors, curious about the commotion, began peeking through their windows and doors to see what was happening on the otherwise peaceful street. Within a few minutes, I noticed a police cruiser turning onto the block and slowly pulling up near the curb, the familiar flashing lights reflecting faintly on the pavement and drawing the attention of a handful of pedestrians and residents who had been watching the situation unfold. And when the officers stepped out of the vehicle and approached, the woman immediately waved them over, pointing at me and delivering a dramatic explanation that I had been watering my plants against her wishes and refusing to comply with her commands, all with a tone that suggested she expected immediate action on the part of law enforcement. One of the officers walked over to my garden, inspecting the neatly watered flower beds and the careful placement of each plant, while I politely explained that I was simply tending to my own property, ensuring that the plants were healthy and that the water had not gone beyond the boundaries of my yard. And after observing the scene and speaking briefly with the woman, the officers quickly determined that no laws were being broken and that the call had been unnecessary. The officers calmly explained to her that watering plants on private property is a perfectly legal activity, that there was no justification for involving emergency services, and that similar calls should be reserved for actual emergencies rather than minor personal annoyances. While I stood quietly, feeling a mixture of relief and incredulity as the woman's confident expression shifted into visible embarrassment, clearly frustrated that her attempt to escalate the situation had failed. Once the police left, the woman returned to her porch, muttering under her breath, but no longer attempting to intervene, while I resumed watering the remaining sections of my garden, reflecting on the absurdity of the situation and marveling at how an ordinary, responsible act like watering one's own plants could be interpreted by someone else as an offense, warranting law enforcement involvement, and reminding myself that entitlement and overreaction are often more about perception than reality. By the time I had finished, every flower, herb, and shrub was thoroughly watered. The soil had absorbed the liquid carefully, and the garden looked refreshed and well cared for, giving me a quiet sense of satisfaction that was heightened by the knowledge that I had maintained composure throughout an encounter that could easily have become confrontational, understanding that patience, calmness, and rationality are often the best responses when dealing with individuals who insist on creating drama out of ordinary life. As I stepped back to admire the neat rows of flowers glistening in the morning sun and the healthy leaves of my herbs and shrubs, I reflected on how the day had begun as a peaceful gardening session and had escalated into an encounter with police intervention over nothing more than the perception of impropriety by someone unable to tolerate ordinary activity on a neighbor's property, reaffirming that maintaining one's own boundaries, staying calm, and focusing on what you can control are far more important than engaging in petty conflicts that others attempt to manufacture. Finally, I gathered up my watering can and hose, put away the gardening tools, and took a last glance at my refreshed and vibrant garden, feeling a quiet but deep sense of triumph and satisfaction in knowing that despite someone else's irrational escalation, I had continued to care for my own property responsibly, maintained my composure in the face of unwarranted confrontation, and ultimately demonstrated that ordinary, lawful, and peaceful behavior cannot and should not be disrupted by the unreasonable expectations or entitlement of others, leaving me with both a renewed appreciation for my garden and a reminder that in life, patience, calmness, and rationality often speak louder than anger or overreaction ever could.